taxes are going to be increased. Are they going to be increased more than they need to be?
Yeah. If the Chancellor succumbs to the noise, the nonsense, that gap has to be filled today by tax increases now. What will happen as a result of tax increases now? It will vaporise business and consumer confidence in the economy. Higher taxes means lower growth now. That is the manifestation of economic madness.
Neil, let's talk UK productivity data. I know you've been critical of the ONS a lot. You've also been critical of the UK's productivity figures before, and this week's update from the ONS seems to have given yet another reason to be distrusting of the output. So just to summarise, they're saying output per hour worked is up 2.1% compared with pre-pandemic levels, but you've argued that those numbers are fundamentally flawed. What is wrong with how the ONS calculates productivity?
I don't have enough access to the data to know exactly what's wrong. But what I do know is that it's wrong. It just does not make sense. And I've written on numerous occasions in recent months about why I think there are flaws in the data. And I think I pointed to some pretty tangible evidence, some pretty credible evidence that demonstrates the flaws. Productivity in particular is an issue. First of all, because the ONS has really struggled to measure accurately output. And of course, when you're measuring productivity, it is basically hours worked and output. It's a measure of the relationship between those two things. My concern has been largely focused on the ONS's inability to accurately measure output. That's been something I've highlighted, particularly in respect, interestingly, in the manufacturing industry. But this week, on the back of the labour force, the labour market data, I looked again at the other bit of that productivity equation, which is how many people are there in work. And it's very clear to me that the ONS is having real problems giving the government and all the other statistics bodies and all the other sort of important decision makers an accurate measure of how many people there are in work. And indeed, I'm not alone in thinking the ONS has got this problem. The ONS have they have admitted in the release earlier this week, the ONS themselves admit quite on a number of occasions that the LFS data, the labour force survey data, it's a survey, by the way, a survey of households.
Yep.
74,000 households that are interviewed to provide data on which the ONS estimate what's going on in the labour market. Seems an odd way to go about doing it, but nevertheless, that's what happens. There are 34 million people employed in the UK. So roughly 1 in 500 people who are employed apparently are interviewed to find out what's actually going on in the labour market. Not sure that's the best. I wouldn't certainly go about it that way if I wanted to find out. What we've got is the ONS admitting that its labour force survey data is not accurate. And in fact, I think there was a shocking admission at the end of a section in the ONS report this week that was dedicated to the LFS, the labour force survey itself, which said, I'm going to quote, LF estimates are currently not considered accredited official statistics and are designated official statistics in development. The labour force survey, on which everybody estimates what UK economy productivity is historically, and of course that base number it forms a really important part of, for example, what the OBR estimate is going to happen to productivity going forward. What the ONS say is that those data are not accredited official statistics. Now, I've seen no reference to this whatsoever in any of the apocalyptic summaries about what's going on in the UK economy and where the economy is going this week, for example. So the Economist article, great example. I think the IFS today have talked about a 22 billion hole in the fiscal arithmetic as a result of their interpretation of what they expect the OBR to say about productivity growth over the next 5 years. So here we are, once again, confronting a situation where all sorts of very learned, very smart, apparently very intelligent people are making judgments about how much tax needs to go up in the UK on the 26th of November. But they're basing those judgments on data, on forecasts going out 5 years, but on data which the creator or the owner of that data says they're not accredited official statistics. And they're not official accredited statistics because the ONS themselves know that they're not right. They know they're wrong. They know there are flaws in the data. You've just got to pause for a moment and think, what? How can the Chancellor of the Exchequer base tax decisions in a few weeks' time on utterly flawed data and forecasts of going forward from flawed data, which the OBRs state themselves are effectively uneducated, educated guesses? You couldn't make it up. It's nonsense. It's madness. We just shouldn't be doing that.
So let's say those figures in the LFS are wrong. What is the downstream impact of that? Because, you might be listening to this saying, well, so what? Maybe we're slightly off on unemployment or slightly off on productivity. So what? What does it mean?
First of all, I think the data is understating UK productivity. Productivity in the UK is much better than the ONS estimates, partly because the ONS have themselves underestimated output. There was a correction a few weeks ago to GDP, nominal GDP. In fact, at the end of June, nominal GDP was upgraded by 2.25% from the forecast the OBR had in place in March this year. That's about £60 billion of output. So not only is there an upgrade to the size of the economy, I think the ONS are overestimating how many people are employed in the economy. Seems a very basic thing, but when you know that they calculate that from interviewing 74,000 households and there are 34 million people in work in the UK, you can start to understand why there might be some mistakes there. Now, what I've done is look back at these data series, because there are other measures of how many people are in work. HMRC, for example, as you would expect, have data about how many people are in employment, because of course they need to know. They're collecting taxes from them. And what it shows is basically that the data series were consistent with each other up to the pandemic. Something very seriously went wrong with the data in and around the pandemic. And there's been significantly greater inconsistency in the data since the pandemic. Now, specifically, over the last 2 years, let's put it over the last 12 months, the HMRC estimates that in 9 of those 12 months, the number of people in payroll employment has gone down in 9 of those 12 months. I think the ONS estimate in the LFS survey says employment has gone up in every month of those 12. You can start to see why the data's wrong. You can start to see there are inconsistencies there. You can start to see the ONS themselves say, don't rely on this data. Well,
yeah,
I wouldn't. And I don't think the Chancellor should. And neither, by the way, do I think the OBR should either.
What is the likely impact on people listening to this if these numbers are wrong? So we've got a budget coming up next month. The very likely scenario is that taxes are going to be increased. Are they going to be increased more than they need to be? Is that really what you're saying?
Yeah. If the Chancellor succumbs to the noise, the nonsense, the sort of the doom-laden consensus says there's a massive black hole. Look, UK productivity over the next 5 years is going to disappoint. We're going to have lower growth as a result. Lower growth means lower tax revenues in 29-30 than the Chancellor forecast back in, or the OBR forecast and the Chancellor embraced back in March this year, and indeed back in October last year. Lower tax revenue means there's a gap in the fiscal arithmetic. That gap has to be filled today. Oh, by the way, that gap exists in 29-30. That gap has to be filled today by tax increases now. What will happen as a result of tax increases now? It will vaporize business and consumer confidence in the economy. Higher taxes means lower growth now. What is the thing that the economy needs more than anything to solve the potential fiscal challenges in the future? It needs more growth. The Chancellor must do all she can to enable, to free up the economy so that it can grow. The Chancellor knows that we need lower rates to sort of trigger that better growth outcome. I think lower rates are coming because inflation is coming down. And the Bank of England will cut rates. I think they may well cut rates in 3 weeks' time in the November 6th meeting. That's really important. But fundamentally, if she succumbs to the nonsense, this idea that let's base our 5-year sort of uneducated guesses on data that we know the ONS themselves know is flawed right now, that is the manifestation of economic madness. It's lunatic. Let's kill the economy now because, nobody would do that. Nobody would do that. It's mad. And yet, that is what the economic consensus says the Chancellor should do. The Economist says it. The IFS says it. The Daily Telegraph says it. We're all doomed. We're all going bust because of these ludicrously unreliable forecasts. If I was a Chancellor, I'd say, sorry, I'm ignoring that nonsense. It's nonsense. You cannot, in all credibility, tell me that those numbers are reliable. They're not reliable. I will base my tax decisions, my tax and spending decisions on contemporaneously more reliable economic data.
I guess the difficulty is doing something like that requires quite a lot of, I guess, bravery, because, if you call that wrong and it turns out the data was right, that's going to be catastrophic in the future if she doesn't raise taxes enough.
Not necessarily, John, because what she can do is adjust tax bill. What she can announce today is a commitment to fiscal responsibility. On the November 26th, she can say, I remain committed to fiscal responsibility. I will adjust tax policy in the future to reflect the numbers that emerge over time. If the economy disappoints on growth, if the economy disappoints on productivity, we'll have to raise taxes in the future. On the other hand, if I'm right, I'm not pretending to be a Chancellor, by the way, but if I'm right about where the economy is going to go, how we will outperform the doom-laden consensus forecasts, if we grow anything like as fast as I think, there will be no fiscal hole in 5 years' time. None at all. Indeed, there will be the fiscal numbers will look much better than expected. She could even cut taxes in the final year of her administration quite easily. It all depends on what happens as you evolve. So she has the opportunity. She can say, we remain fiscally responsible. I will adjust policy. I will adjust tax policy to reflect the new information that will emerge over time. At the moment, we are, I think, the second fastest growing G7 economy. The economy has grown, according to the ONS, in every quarter since this government was elected. Nothing to do with the government, by the way. But just imagine how fast the economy would have grown if it hadn't been hit in the face with a baseball bat when we had much higher increases in taxation last October. Imagine how fast the economy would have grown then. The fact is that there is growth potential in the economy. It is being unleashed. It will be triggered by lower interest rates. We scored an own goal on inflation as a result of all the measures that were introduced in the budget last October. That's created more inflation than would have occurred had we not had those measures. But inflation is going to be coming down significantly. It starts in October. November data will show October's inflation numbers. Okay. And so I think interest rates are definitely coming down. They'll come down more quickly than people think. This will unleash growth in the economy. If I'm right, the budget arithmetic will look after itself. The economy will generate through that growth the revenue that she needs to bring the deficit down and to give her the headroom that she needs, the 10 billion headroom that she needs in fiscal 29-30.